Uh, was overnight Israel conducted airstrikes in Qatar. No, that's not escalating things at all. The airstrikes were targeting Hamas leadership. And see, this is the case here, is that the Hamas leadership don't live in the Palestinian territories. They live and raise funds in Qatar, the UAE at some point. They live elsewhere in the Middle East and live in luxury. At least um, Arafat spent a lot of his time in the actual Palestinian territories, whilst also siphoning money out and everything else. But uh, so it's not the first time Israel has targeted Hamas leadership elsewhere in the Middle East. Now they've come out and said that yes, they notified the US they were about to do it. They also notified Qatar that they were conducting a strike against Hamas presence. Now, I don't know the relationship between Qatar and Hamas. I'm sure they know they exist, or they know that there are their leaders within their borders. I don't know what the intent is for removing them. People sort of half see Qatar as sort of progressive, sort of not. I mean, Al Jazeera is based out of Qatar as well. They're not as hardline as other Middle Eastern nations. They're probably more hardline than others. They're an interesting mix. The US has a very big military presence there through Al Udeid Air Base and presumably using their port facilities in Doha. But the prior notification to Doha, to Qatar, there's a question how much of that filtered down to the Hamas leadership. When, if you look back at Rhodesia slash Zimbabwe during that transition phase when Rhodesia was fighting its bush war prior to independence, they did cross-border raids into Mozambique and um, I forget the name of the city that they raided into, but it was known that um, ZANU and there was another couple of other names of independence fighting groups, or largely Marxist slash socialist um, rebels. They were living openly in Mozambique and were being feted by European leaders and things like this. Um, yeah, the whole transition from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe and the global political winds and everything else. That's quite an interesting thing. So the Rhodesians were conducting cross-border raids from time to time to try and target the leaders, like Mugabe was targeted repeatedly. But in order to do so, they didn't necessarily tell Mozambique what was going on, but they certainly told England, or England found out through various paths, and there was a suspicion that the um, uh, they used various diplomatic channels to warn them, and the leaders were therefore able to escape the outcomes of what went on. Now, that obviously upset the Rhodesian forces involved because they undertook very risky missions for very limited outcomes. It could have been a very surgical strike, solved what they would have seen as a lot of problems, and gone merrily on with their way. With this, where the leadership happened to avoid the strike, yeah, I'm sure there's people that will allege, and we'll probably talk about a link between the uh, the government in Qatar and whatever happened. I'm sure that that might come out in due course. But yeah, I can understand why Israel wants to remove them. I can also understand why people get a little bit sensitive about Israel reaching out into other nations to conduct military strikes. Um, there's got to be consequences at some point for this sort of activity. You want to make sure you're right before you go about it. I mean, it certainly seemed to stop Iran recently, but I think that's more the exception than the rule. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. And sadly, there were a couple of Qataris who died and were wounded as a result. So, yeah, and obviously a lot of people come out and said, "You've done what now?"